Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. We love taking these sources that you provide and really extracting those crucial insights so you don't have to.
Yeah, that's the whole idea, right?
Yeah,
You send us the source and we dig in and we'll tell you what really matters.
exactly. We try to connect the dots and make sure that you understand it all without needing to, spend all that time reading through all this stuff.
We do the hard work for you.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we are looking at,
We are in the weeds.
we are in the weeds. We are in the weeds with CREIT.fact.sec-17A package 2024.2025-0331.pdf.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. And you know what is CREIT? Some of you might not even know.
Yeah, CREIT stands for Citicore Energy REIT Corp. Now, you might have heard of REITs before, right? Real Estate Investment Trust. But CREIT is specifically focused on owning income-generating real estate, but in the renewable energy sector here in the Philippines.
So not your typical REIT that owns malls and shopping centers.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're talking about land and properties that are really integral to generating clean energy, primarily solar power.
Primarily solar, yeah.
And it's interesting to note that they used to be called Infinity Philippines Renewable Resources, Inc. So you might see that name floating around in some of the older docs.
Yeah, keep an eye out for that.
So, what are we trying to understand in this deep dive? What should you, the listener, expect to understand by the end?
Really, the goal here is to give you a good understanding of CREIT's business model, how they've been performing recently, and what their prospects look like going forward, all based on this report that you provided.
Right, just trying to make sure you have a good grasp of this specific, part of the renewable energy world in the Philippines.
This little niche, yeah.
Without you needing to go and do it yourself.
Exactly.
So let's start at the top level. What's the company strategy? What are they all about?
So as we said, they're all about owning and investing in real estate that generates income from renewable energy sources. So this includes the land itself and the infrastructure that makes power generation possible.
Right, makes sense.
And for shareholders, their value proposition really comes down to several key elements. The potential for stable income opportunities for earnings growth, high quality assets, in a sector with increasing demand for electricity, and, the land could go up in value too.
Right. So a nice mix of income and potential for, growth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also emphasize the support they get from their sponsors,
Yeah.
the Citicore Group, and the expertise of their management team.
Okay.
And something that's really important for a REIT is that they have a policy of distributing at least 95% of their distributable income to shareholders as dividends.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. That's pretty typical of REITs, though. That's why a lot of people like investing in REITs, because you get that cash flow coming back to you.
Makes a lot of sense. This report also talks about some big corporate changes they made in 2021. What was going on there?
2021 was a big year for them. That's when they officially became Citicore Energy REIT Corp, kind of signaling, their new strategic focus.
Okay.
They also significantly increased their authorized capital stock.
Which is essentially just creating more shares, right?
Yeah, creating more shares that they could issue later on.
Okay.
And the reason they did that was to facilitate these things called property for share swaps, where essentially the parent company, Citicore Renewable Energy Corporation, or CREC, and Citicore Solar Tarlac 1, Inc., also called Citicore Tarlac 1, transferred land to CREIT in exchange for these newly issued shares.
Okay, so they get the land and the Citicore entities get shares in this new REIT.
Exactly, yeah. And it wasn't just, paper pushing. They also had to amend their articles of incorporation to formally be a REIT and list their shares on the Philippine Stock Exchange, or PSE.
Right, got to be a publicly traded company.
Got to be publicly traded, yeah.
And when did those shares start trading?
So they began trading on February 22, 2022, under the ticker symbol CREIT, with an IPO price of 2 pesos and 55 centavos per share.
Interesting. Okay, and then as of the end of last year, how many shares did they have outstanding?
So as of December 31, 2024, there were 6,545,454,004 shares issued and outstanding.
Okay, so we talked about those property for share swaps. They were focused on this Armenia property in Tarlac. Can you give us a little more detail on that?
Sure. So the report talks about how in 2021, CREIT entered into agreements with both CRACE and Citicore Tarlac 1 for 11 parcels of land in Barangay Armenia, Tarlac.
11 parcels? Wow.
Yeah, so CRAC contributed 1 parcel, and Citicore Tarlac 1 contributed 10.
Okay.
And in return, they received newly issued shares of CREIT.
Makes sense.
So that was kind of the main way that CREIT got its initial set of properties.
Right, and what is the relationship like between all these different Citicore entities? It's kind of confusing.
It is a bit of a family tree. So Citicore Tarlac 1 is what they call an indirect subsidiary of CREIT, meaning that CREIT owns it through another company.
Okay.
And CREIT itself is a subsidiary of CPI, which is another big holding company in the Citicore group.
Right, got it. So it's all kind of interconnected.
Yeah, it's all connected.
So the report also mentions a fund manager and a property manager. Who are these guys and what do they do for CREIT?
Yeah, so the fund manager is Citicore Fund Managers, Inc. And the property manager isn't explicitly named, but it's another subsidiary within CREC.
Okay,
And they're both part of that Citicore group.
got it.
So the fund manager handles overseeing CREIT's assets, making investment decisions and stuff like that.
Okay.
And the property manager handles the day-to-day operations of the properties, making sure everything's running smoothly.
And they both get paid for their services, right?
Yeah, they both get paid. The fund manager gets a fee of 0.5% of the guaranteed base lease,
Okay.
and the property manager gets 1.5%.
Makes sense. So they get a cut of the rent, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool. One other thing I noticed is that they won an award. What was that all about?
Yeah, they won the Best Green Bond Award from the Asset AAA Awards for Sustainable Finance in 2024.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It shows that they're committed to financing their renewable energy projects in a responsible way.
Right. Very cool. Okay, let's talk about the bigger picture here in the Philippines, the market for renewable energy. The report mentions something called the Philippine Energy Plan. What's that all about?
Yeah, so the Philippine Energy Plan, or PKI, it's for the years 2023 to 2050, and it sets some pretty big goals for how much energy the Philippines wants to get from renewable sources.
Oh, okay.
So by 2030, they want 35% of their energy to be renewable, and by 2040, they want 50%.
Wow. Those are some ambitious targets.
There. Yeah, it's good for companies like CREIT, though, because it creates a lot of demand for what they do.
Makes sense. Does the PEEP talk about any specific challenges or opportunities within that transition?
It does, yeah. So according to the P, there's a projected gap in renewable energy generation.
Okay.
They think they'll need about 58 gigawatts peak of solar capacity by 2040 to meet their goals.
58 gigawatts peak?
Yeah.
It's massive.
That's a lot of solar panels. And that represents a big opportunity for companies like CREIT, who, own the land where these solar panels can go.
So they're well positioned to, benefit from that.
Exactly.
What about the Citicore group itself? What are their growth targets?
Yeah, so the Citicore group is planning to grow its own solar capacity to 1.5 gigawatts direct current by 2025.
Okay.
And because CREIT is part of that group, it's likely that they'll benefit from that growth, through future acquisitions of properties.
Right. So they can kind of piggyback on their sponsor's success.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense. Are there any regulations in place that could help this growth?
Yeah, so the Department of Energy, or DOE, has something called Renewable Portfolio Standards, or RPS.
Okay.
And those require energy providers to source a certain percentage of their power from renewables.
Okay, so that's good for business.
Yeah, that's good for business. And the report also says that there are some expected power shortages coming up in the Philippines. And renewable energy projects like solar can be built faster than traditional power plants. So that's another opportunity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speed is definitely an advantage there. What does CREIT think about the future of solar in the Philippines? Are they optimistic?
Yeah, they seem pretty optimistic.
Yeah.
They say they believe in the low levelized cost of electricity of solar, which basically means that the cost of producing solar energy is becoming more and more competitive.
Right.
They also think that solar can help meet both the base load demand, which is the minimum amount of electricity needed at all times, and the peak demand, which is when everyone's using a lot of electricity at the same time.
Okay, so they think it's versatile.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've talked about the Citicore Group's pipeline of projects. How does that factor into CREIT's future?
Yeah, so the Citicore Group has a lot of renewable energy projects in the works.
Okay.
And CREIT sees that as a potential source of new properties to buy in the future.
Right, so they can just keep growing their portfolio.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about their current operations. What properties do they already have?
So right now they have 7 leased properties.
Okay.
And they're located in Clark, Armenia, Toledo, Silay, Dalaya, Bulacan, and South Cotabato.
All over the place.
Yeah, all over the Philippines.
That's cool. And how much electricity can these properties generate?
So altogether, the solar power plants on those properties have a combined capacity of 145 megawatts peak direct current,
Sure.
or MWPDC.
145 milliliter PDC.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's a lot of power.
That's a good chunk of energy. How reliable are these solar power plants?
So the report mentioned something called the solar power plant availability ratio.
Okay.
And for most of their properties in 2024, that ratio was above 99%.
99%. So they're pretty much always up and running.
Yeah, pretty much. They're very reliable.
Very good. And what about the efficiency of those plants? How much sunlight are they actually converting into electricity?
Yeah, so the report also has something called the performance ratio.
Okay.
And that was pretty consistent in 2024, too. It was generally in the mid to high 70s.
Okay. Not bad. Not bad. And we talked before about how CREIT wants to grow through acquisitions. Can you remind us how they plan to do that?
Yeah, so as we said, they're very closely tied to the Citicore group.
Right.
And the Citicore group wants to have 1.5 GOBDC of capacity by 2025.
Okay.
So CREIT is going to be looking for opportunities to buy the land under those new solar plants.
Makes sense.
And they've actually already bought some land in 2023 that they're leasing out to the Citicore group for new projects that are still under construction.
Okay, so they're not waiting around.
No, they're getting involved early.
That's cool. Okay, let's talk about the people behind CREIT who's running the show.
So the report mentions Edgar Saavedra, who is the chairman of the board, and Oliver Y. Tan, who is the president and CEO.
Okay.
They both have tons of experience in the energy sector, and they've been key players in the Citicore group's growth.
Right, so they know what they're doing.
Yeah, they definitely know what they're doing.
How does CREIT describe itself, within the renewable energy industry? What makes them special?
They call themselves the largest landlord of renewable energy properties in the Philippines.
Makes sense.
Yeah, which kind of emphasizes that their focus is on the real estate side of things, not on actually operating the power plants.
Right, they're the landlords, not the power plant operators.
Exactly.
Okay, the report mentions this interesting concept called agro-solar. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so agro-solar is basically where they combine solar power generation with agriculture on the same land.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, they're doing it at their properties in Clark, Armedia, Delayap, and Bulacan. And it's designed to create extra income for local farmers.
So it's like a win-win.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. What about their broader efforts to be environmentally friendly?
Yeah, so they try to minimize their environmental impact in a few different ways. They choose sites that don't have a lot of trees already, so they don't have to cut down a lot of trees.
Okay.
And they're big on recycling water. They use recycled water to clean their solar panels and for their agro-solar projects.
That's smart.
Yeah, it helps them conserve water.
Very cool. And they're also involved in some community building activities, right?
Yeah, they do a lot for the communities where they operate.
Okay.
They offer training programs, scholarships, and they prioritize hiring people from those communities.
That's awesome. Are there any other awards or recognition they've gotten?
Yeah, so besides the Best Green Bond Award,
Mm.
they've also been recognized for being the first renewable energy REIT in the Philippines.
Okay, a real pioneer.
Yeah, a real pioneer.
Very cool. The report also talks about the importance of their employees. What do they say about that?
Yeah, they say that their employees are crucial to their success.
Okay.
They have a great team, and they're always working to make their organization even stronger.
That's great to hear. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty now. Let's talk about their financials. How did they perform in 2024 compared to 2023?
Okay, so first looking at their assets, there was a big decrease in prepayments and other current assets.
Okay.
And that was mainly because they got a big value-added tax or VAT refund.
Uh-huh.
So that was money they had paid out before that they got back.
Okay.
And then their non-current assets actually went up.
Okay.
And that was mostly because of adjustments to how they recognize lease revenue.
Makes sense.
It's just an accounting thing.
Right. Okay, what about their property, plant, and equipment and their investment properties?
So property, plant, and equipment went down a bit, which is normal because of depreciation. Things wear out over time.
Right.
And then investment properties went up a little bit, which was mainly because they bought some more land and because of amortization of leasehold assets.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about their liabilities? Any big changes there?
Yeah, so current liabilities went up a bit, mainly because of taxes they had to pay on their bonds and dividends.
Okay.
And then non-current liabilities also went up, mostly because of security deposits they got for new projects and amortization of bond issuance costs.
Okay, so just normal stuff.
Yeah, normal stuff.
Last thing on their financials. What happened with their equity?
So their equity went up overall. And that was mostly because of the net income they earned during the year and because of dividends they paid out.
Okay, and they paid out quite a lot in dividends, right?
Yeah, they did. They actually paid out more in dividends than they had in distributable income in 2022, 2023, and 2024.
Wow, that's interesting. The report also mentions the net asset value per share. What's that all about?
Yeah, so the net asset value per share is basically a way to measure the intrinsic value of each share,
Okay.
and it's calculated using the fair value of their assets.
Makes sense. And then lastly, what can you tell us about their leverage ratio and their ability to borrow more money?
So their leverage ratio tells us how much debt they're using compared to their equity.
Okay.
And it's pretty low, which is generally a good thing. It means they're not too risky.
Okay.
And then the report also says how much more they're allowed to borrow based on their loan agreements.
Okay, so they have some room to grow if they need to.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to some of the legal stuff. Now, the report mentions an ongoing arbitration case. What's that all about?
Yeah, so there's a case going on at the Singapore International Arbitration Center,
Okay.
and it involves Infinity Philippines Technology Services, Inc.,
Mm-hmm.
and Infinity Asia Pacific Limited as the claimants, and CREIT as the respondent.
So who are the claimants?
They're companies that were involved in the development of the Conception solar power project back in 2015,
Okay.
which was before CREIT was acquired by the Citicore group.
Got it.
And they're basically claiming that CREIT owes them money for some services they provided.
Okay. And what's CREIT's position on this?
So CREIT says that they have a letter of indemnity agreement with the previous owners of the company.
Okay.
And that agreement says that the previous owners will cover any costs that come up from this claim.
Okay, so they're not too worried about it.
Yeah, they're not too worried about it. The arbitration is still ongoing, though.
Okay, so we'll have to see what happens. The report also mentions some legal proceedings involving Oliver Y. Tan and Edgar B. Saavedra. They're the chairman and CEO, right?
Well, that's right.
Okay.
So what's going on there?
So this case is about GMR Megawide Cebu Airport Corporation, or GMCAC,
Okay.
which is a consortium that operates the Mactan Cebu International Airport.
Okay.
And both Mr. Tan and Mr. Saavedra are involved in Megawide Construction Corporation, which is a big part of GMCAC.
Okay, so it's a separate company, but they're involved.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So in 2020, a complaint was filed alleging that GMCAC was violating the anti-dummy law.
Okay, what's the anti-dummy law?
It's basically a law that prevents foreign nationals from controlling businesses that are supposed to be owned by Filipinos.
Okay.
And the complaint alleged that foreign nationals were improperly controlling GMCAC.
Okay.
So the National Bureau of Investigation recommended prosecution, and the Department of Justice indicted the GMCAC executives, including Mr. Tan and Mr. Saavedra.
Yeah, but both of them have denied the allegations.
Mm-hmm.
They say that the foreign nationals were only advisors
Mm-hmm.
and that Filipinos were always in control,
Okay.
and they're actually fighting the indictment.
So it's not over yet.
No, it's not over yet.
Okay. Let's talk about CREIT's corporate governance. How do they make sure they're doing things the right way?
So they have a strong commitment to good corporate governance.
Okay.
They follow all the rules and regulations from the SEC, the PSE, and other relevant bodies.
Okay.
They really emphasize honesty, integrity,
Yeah.
fairness, accountability, and transparency.
Right. So all the good stuff.
Yeah, all the good stuff.
Who's on their board of directors?
So as of December 31st, 2024, their board of directors has 8 members.
Okay.
Edgar B. Saavedra is the chairman.
Yeah.
And Oliver Y. Tan is a director, the president and CEO.
Right.
And they also have several independent directors, which is
Yeah.
important for good governance.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to sustainability and social responsibility. They often call this ESG. What do they have to say about that?
Yeah. So starting with their procurement practices, they try to use local suppliers whenever possible.
Okay.
And that aligns with CREC's sustainability guidelines, which emphasize supporting local businesses and minimizing environmental impact.
That's good.
Yeah, they're also really serious about anti-corruption.
Okay.
All of their employees, management, and business partners have to go through anti-corruption training.
Wow.
100%.
100%.
Yeah, 100%. And they say they haven't had any incidents of corruption.
That's impressive.
Yeah, it's good to see.
What about their environmental efforts? Do they track their resource consumption?
Yeah, they do. They track their energy use, they track their gasoline and diesel consumption, and they track their electricity use.
Okay.
They're also very careful about how they manage water. They recycle a lot of water, and they're careful not to damage ecosystems when they choose sites for their projects.
Okay. So they're trying to be responsible.
Exactly, yeah.
What about waste management? How do they handle that?
So they have recycling programs in place at all their sites, and they use DNR accredited companies to dispose of any hazardous waste.
Okay.
They're also planning to donate some of their recyclable waste to local communities to use infrastructure projects.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's a cool way to give back.
Are Are they in compliance with all the environmental regulations?
Yes, they are. All their solar power plants have the necessary permits, and they have pollution control officers to make sure everything's running smoothly.
Okay, good to know. Let's switch gears to the social side of things. How do they treat their employees?
So they say they treat their employees very well.
Okay.
They offer comprehensive benefits that are better than the minimum requirements in the Philippines,
Okay.
and they have a strong focus on safety. They reported zero work-related injuries or fatalities.
That's impressive.
Yeah, it's very good.
What about diversity and inclusion?
So they track the gender breakdown of their workforce,
Okay.
and they also use senior personnel to train local hires, which helps to build skills in the community.
That's a good program.
Yeah.
Do they have any policies about human rights?
Yeah, they have strict policies against forced labor and child labor,
Okay, good.
and they have a code of business conduct and ethics, and a supplier code of conduct that everyone has to follow.
Right, so they're really trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, they are.
We talked about their community engagement already, but is there anything else they do besides the agro-solar program?
Yeah, they have a bunch of other community programs. They offer skills training scholarships, and they prioritize hiring people from the local communities.
So they're really invested in the communities where they operate.
Yeah, definitely.
That's awesome. Last question on this topic. How did they handle customer management?
So they say they haven't received any complaints about the health and safety of their services or about customer privacy.
Okay, that's good.
And they don't use customer information for any other purposes besides what the customer agreed to.
Right, so they're respecting privacy.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, cool. Do they align themselves with any of the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, they do. They specifically mention SDG 7, which is about affordable and clean energy, and SDG 13, which is about climate action.
Okay, so they're trying to contribute to a bigger cause.
Yeah, definitely.
Very cool. All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here today thanks to the information in this report. Let's take a moment to summarize the key takeaways for our listeners.
Okay, so basically what we've seen is that CREIT is a major player in the renewable energy sector in the Philippines. Their growth is tied to the Citicore Group's expansion. They have a good track record of operational performance, and they're committed to sustainability and community engagement.
And of course, we need to remember that this is just a snapshot based on this one report.
Right, it's important to remember that.
The renewable energy sector is constantly changing, and there are always new challenges and opportunities popping up.
Exactly, yeah.
So considering the Philippines' goals for renewable energy and CREIT's role in the market, what do you think the future holds for specialized REITs like this? And what other factors might be important for their success in the long run?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something for all of us to think about as the Philippines moves towards a more sustainable energy future.
Absolutely. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in to another deep dive.
See you next time.
Bye.